name is Kay French, and on behalf of the Houston County Historical Society, the Friends of the Library, and the Houston County Public Library, we would like to welcome you to this special event tonight, honoring Lieutenant Colonel Tom C. McKenney and his book, Jack Hinson's One Man's War, a Civil War Sniper. We want to welcome the real Hinson family and friends that are gathered here with us tonight. They're on the front row, and several people that have helped Colonel McKenney and his research are here. And before Vanetta introduces Colonel McKenney, she's our president of the Historical Society, I want to say it has been a privilege knowing Colonel McKenney and finally coming to this point. It took a very long time, probably a lot longer than he ever wanted it to take. But I think if Jack Hinson were here tonight, he would be so pleased that this wonderful man, Colonel McKenney, tried so hard to tell his story. And I think he would be pleased that Jack Hinson's story has finally been told. So before we get to Colonel McKenney, we would like to introduce Mr. Jim Joe, who is the historian at Fort Donelson National Park, who will explain a little bit about the battle and the aftermath of the battle at Fort Donelson. Let's give a big welcome to Mr. Jim Joe.
Thank you, folks. It's a pleasure to be here. As a matter of fact, I see friendly faces out in the audience. I've been over here several times lately for the Rotary Club and so forth speaking, so it's a pleasure to be back, and always enjoy coming back and talking with anybody about the Civil War and the history of the area. I'm not going to bore you too long, but I want to talk they want me to talk for a few minutes to just sort of tell the story of what leads up to the time when rifle was going to be used and Jack Hinson starts to become involved. As many of you know, this area is going to be deeply involved in the Civil War early on. And it's because of the geography. The rivers we have in this area, the Cumberland River and the Tennessee River, as well as railroads that are in the area, are going to be critical to both armies. Tennessee is going to secede from the Union and try to join the Confederacy and form this new southern nation. Kentucky is not. So the Tennessee-Kentucky border becomes a boundary between these two sections of country. It becomes a boundary between the two new countries. And the South is going to try to defend itself. Everybody realizes that the rivers and railroads are going to be critical. In my humble opinion, one reason this war lasts 4 long years is because of the huge job the Northern Army has. They've got this vast southern territory to invade, occupy, and control. Does them no good. You know, they might train and equip the world's most powerful army, but what good is it going to do if it's marching around in Illinois, Indiana, and Pennsylvania? They've got to bring the army into the South, and to do that, they need rivers and railroads to move these vast numbers of men and the tons and tons and tons of war material that these armies are going to require. So that's why Fort Donelson and Fort Henry were built, to guard these two rivers. That's why they occupied Bowling Green, Kentucky, because of the railroad. Columbus on the Mississippi River, to guard these rivers. I'm sure as many of you know, early in the war, early February of 1862, Union Army will move against Fort Henry and capture it. February the 6th, 10 days later, they're going to move against Fort Donelson and capture it, opening up Middle Tennessee. As a result of that, Nashville is abandoned. Union Army moves into Nashville. So this area has a sort of dubious honor, you might say, of being occupied very early in the war, and remaining so for the entire war by the Union Army. So Dover, Clarksville, Nashville is occupied by the Union Army very early, and Clarksville was taken back by the South for a brief time, but for most of the war, all this area is going to be occupied by the Union Army. Now what that does, what that sets up is the situation it sets up is martial law. Now if you're a citizen of Dover, Clarksville, or Nashville, and if you stay, if you don't leave, you've got to do what the Army says. If you want to go out of town, you've got to have a military pass. And if the colonel doesn't think you need to leave town, then you can't go. So you're under martial law. The closer you are to those military camps, the more control they have over you, the more control they'll exercise in the daily situation. So that's the situation in Dover and Stewart County and Montgomery County and Clarksville. And it's martial law, and all the citizens of these counties have either got to do what the Army sees, get along with them, leave town. Some people learn to sell things to the Army. Some people actually benefited by it, by selling things to the Army. And as you get out of Dover, Dover's occupied for the rest of the war because of the river. They're trying to keep the river open. As you get away from Dover and Stewart County, over in what is now Houston County or Humphreys County, the military has less control. But it's still occupied territory. And I think throughout history there are all numbers of examples of when an army moves in and occupies territory. It happened in France in World War II, for example. The French underground came up, and they to hamper and harass the German war effort. Well, here in Stewart County, and what is now Houston County, Humphreys County, across the state, locals would they call it guerrilla warfare. Locals would try to organize sometimes or whatever, and they would try to hamper and harass the Union, the occupying force. And that's the error of when Jack Hinson is going to emerge. It's in that era of trying to do something to harass this Union occupying force. The Union Army will build a fort there in Dover later in the war, and some of their accounts, they talk about some of the Union soldiers that were camped there, talk about it. And they said, like, you know, they were glad to be away from the front lines of the war, some of them. They weren't having to fight any heavy battles. They thought that was good. Life here was pretty good at this camp. I mean, if you stand your guard like you're supposed to and drill a couple hours a day, the rest of the time the officers will leave you alone, and life here is pretty good until we go out in the county. They'll go out on patrols. And there's two areas that I remember they mentioned distinctly that they didn't like going. And some of you may be familiar with the Standing Rock area in Stewart County. They mentioned if you go down Standing Rock Creek, people shoot at you. And they didn't like that much. They didn't like that much. And as you can well imagine. And they also mentioned, but what they really hated worse than that was to head off down toward here and wave. Oh God, that was bad. Because they never knew what they were going to run into, and they never knew, you know, what was going to happen, and they always created things. So that's, I just wanted to set the stage a little for you to tell you about that's what was going on. The area was occupied by the Union Army, and there were a lot of people who would then try to resist that occupation and try to hamper them in whatever way they could. And some people hampered a little bit, some people hampered a lot. But that's the time period, and that's the situation where Jack Hinson and others emerged in that time period of the local history of the Civil War. I'm going to leave it there. I think Tom McKenney will be able to take over from there and handle it very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. And while I've got a captive audience, I'm going to do a commercial. I'm Vanetta James with the Houston County Historical Society, and I'm wanting to announce next month's meeting will be May 12th, 2 o'clock here at Erin City Hall. We have another joint venture with the Friends of the Library. We are hosting another book signing. We're going to do that in conjunction with honoring our Houston County World War II veterans. And Pat Garland, a former Houston County resident, has written a book entitled The Forgotten Soldier, The Life and Times of Major General Harry Hill Banshose. And we would like to invite everyone to come next month on the 12th. Enough of the commercial. After Colonel McKenney's remarks, we have a table set up over here with the books where you can purchase the books and have them autographed. We'll also have Mr. McCormick and Judge McFarland there with the rifle. You all are welcome to stay and visit, look at the book, have them sign, have their pictures. The Friends of the Library and the ladies of the Houston County Historical Society have refreshments over here, coordinated by Susan Bell, and she's done a beautiful job. So y'all get refreshments. You can have a light dinner and just spread for dinner hour now. And we just appreciate every Company. Lieutenant Colonel Tom McKenney was born in Lexington, Kentucky, and is a graduate of the University of Kentucky and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is a retired infantry officer and parachutist in the United States Marine Corps, having served in Korea and Vietnam. As an advocate for American prisoners of war, he has appeared on CBS Radio, the 700 Club, Fox News, the Today Show, and CBS Morning News to discuss veterans affairs. His own war stories are featured in a book entitled Spite House, The Last Secret of the War in Vietnam, written by former 60 Minutes producer Monica Jensen Stevenson, and the rights to his story have been purchased by Columbia Pictures. Lieutenant Colonel McKenney is an experienced author, contributing articles to Guidepost, American Legion magazine, Military magazine, and Leatherneck magazine. He has published several books on a variety of topics. His newest book, Jack Hinson, One Man's War, marks a combination of 15 years of research into a piece of American history that has been lost for more than a century. We have some other special guests with us tonight, but I'm going to let Colonel McKenney introduce them as he unfolds the story of his research on Jack Hinson.
Thank you. I'm particularly glad to have Jimmy Jones here tonight. He's the reigning authority on the war, the battles at Fort Donelson, and the war in this area. And I want to introduce Frances Hinson first. Frances, will you stand up, please? She's the widow of one of Jack Hinson's great-grandsons, and we wouldn't be here tonight without her. The book could not have been written without the help that I got from her, and she never lost her zeal for it. She'd been pursuing the story for years before I met her, and having her here tonight makes it very special for me. Probably already know Joe McCormick is here. He did the artwork for the book, including that beautiful cover. And Judge McFarland is here, who owns the rifle because he inherited it. It has come down through his family all the way from Jack Hinson. Jack Hinson, at the end of the war, gave it to Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was his friend. Forrest gave it to Major Charles Anderson, who was his adjutant and close friend throughout the war. And Major Anderson passed it down through his family to Judge McFarland. He's the current custodian of this most interesting rifle. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm indebted to so many people, and I see several of you here that are in the acknowledgments page, and you can't put everybody in, and then you worry about who you might have left out. I'm glad to see Ava here. I haven't seen her forever. She gave me the story of the slave who came back to look for the silver. And after this is over, and we'll be mercifully short in speaking, Joe McCormick and Judge McFarland will both be glad to inscribe the books for you also. And I'll tell you just a little bit about how it happened. Like most things in my life, I never intended for it to or expected it to, but about in the mid-1960s, I was driving across what used to be Between the Rivers, and which was by that time the Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area, and I was thinking about those people and the communities that were gone, and what is to me a tragedy that they were driven from their homes. And I was passing through what used to be Golden Pond, and on the right side of the road I saw a historical marker, and I always try to stop and read historical markers. And this one told me of a man named Jack Hinson, who in 1862 had two of his sons murdered by Union occupying troops, and how he had set out to get vengeance, and by the end of the war he had killed 36 of them. And I thought, man, I'd really like to pursue that story. I want to know more about this man. That's incredibly interesting to me, but I couldn't I had to go on with my life doing what I did. And about 1993, I think, I can't remember exactly when these things happened, I had a slight stroke. But it was a warning, and I gave myself a month off to recover. And I thought, I can't just sit around for a month and do nothing. What could I do for a month that would be interesting but not stressful? And I remembered that historical marker at Golden Pond. And I drove back there. And I took a picture of it, thought about it. And each historical marker has a unique serial number on it that is a key to the file in Frankfurt or Nashville upon which it's based. And so then I went to Frankfurt, and I had that number. And I looked up the file, and I was disappointed to find that there was almost nothing in it. I mean, almost nothing. A few letters, the wording that went on the marker, which we had anyway. And I wondered why there was so little in the file. But that's where I started. And because the marker was in Golden Pond, I started my search up there. And I went to all those reunions those people have in the summertime. I put ads in all the county newspapers, and I got no result. Well, I did. I got two really helpful things from a guy in Waverly. But my month ended. I found the rifle, made my way to the McFarland's home, and I found a story in the archives at the National Tennessean about the rifle, and they were gracious enough to let me come in the door and see the rifle and measure it and photograph it, and my month ended. 3 years later, I had another stroke. Again, I gave myself a month to recover from it, and this time I was looking for the family. I put another 100 ads in all the newspapers, including yours, and Frances got the newspaper, but she never noticed the ad. By this time, I had realized that I was looking too far north, just a little bit too far north. And so I was making the rounds of all these county libraries, and I mean all of them. And I would go to each one and photocopy. I'd look everything I could find with the word Hinson in it. I would photocopy it. And I had been doing this till I was cross-eyed. And I'd been in Aaron for about a week and had exhausted everything that Kay had. And I was on the way out the door, tired, just kind of wondering if I'd ever find these people. And I was leaving for the last time. I was gone. And as I went out the door, Kay French said to me, "You really should contact Frances Hinson." And I was so tired, the name didn't even ring a bell. Can you imagine that? I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, she's really active in the Historical Society, and she might be able to help you." So she gave me the phone number and handed me a telephone. And I called. And this grumpy man answered the phone. And I told him who I was, and I said, "May I speak with Frances Hinson, please?" He said, "No." Hinson men are not always gracious. They're not always charming, but they always mean what they say. And what do you say? I didn't know what to say next, so I said, "Look, I'm looking for the story of this man, and I can't find his family." I said, "Kid, do you have any idea how I might find it?" I don't know why I was asking him that, because he didn't want to talk to me anyway. But I did, and he said, "I'm his great-grandson." And I either dropped the telephone or nearly dropped the telephone. And I went straight. He wouldn't let me come out there that day, Francis, but I came the first time he let me show up, and it was Dudley, her husband, and from that time on, he was extremely helpful, as was his brother Stuart. Both of them are now gone. There were two great-granddaughters living at the time. One of them, not interested at all. I've never met her. And the other one lives in Montana, and being a Hinson, sometimes she was helpful and sometimes she didn't want to be bothered. But meeting Frances was the key. She had been digging into this story in every way she could for a long time, and she gave me a springboard. And not only that, but contact with people like Nina Finley, who had also been researching everything she could find, every rock she could turn over in this area. She made a record of it. And that's how we really began to make progress. And then, of course, I've been to not just every county library in this part of the world, but the Tennessee State Archives, the Kentucky State Archives, the National Archives, the rare collections at Duke University and the University of North Carolina, and Austin Peay and others. The Hinson collection in Louisville, Kentucky. I've been everywhere I could think of to go. I've literally traveled thousands of miles. I was interviewed recently by the Washington Times. They're going to review the book very favorably, I'm happy to say. And the guy asked me, what were your major sources? And I said, there aren't any. That's right. I said, it's like working a jigsaw puzzle with the pieces scattered over thousands of miles and a lot of them missing. And that, because there is so little to be had, every little piece, such as Ava, the story Ava gave me about the slave who fled and then came back to see if she could dig up the silver, the one who resisted the troops and then fled for fear of her life because she had resisted them. If she hadn't told me that, I wouldn't have known that. And so everything I found was precious, and I put together the pieces I was able to find, and that's how the book came to be. I wrote it for the University of Tennessee Press. The acquisitions editor there is a friend of mine, and he wanted to publish it, but when you're dealing with academic publishers, you have to go through a thing called peer review. So they pay 3 expert historians in the field to read the manuscript and comment on it, and the first 2 were very, very helpful. It takes a long time, too, which bothers me. I'm compulsive about getting things done. And the third one was a jerk, a snob, and he sat on it for a year while I paced the floor, and then he dismissed it with a wave of his hand and said it was poor scholarship. And he didn't even bother to write the written report, which he'd been paid to write. I mean, I hope I never meet him. The way they do it, you're not supposed to know who he is, but I know what he is. I hope we never meet. However, the acquisitions editor there gave me suggestions as to other publishers, and that's how I wound up with Pelican. And now I thank God every day that that jerk dismissed my book, because I think Pelican was the perfect publisher for the book. They're very strong on Southern heritage. They're very strong on American heritage and Southern history. And that's how the book came to be. I guess the thing to do now would be to see if you have questions about it.
Y'all, let me say this. I borrowed the book from the library. I'll buy mine tonight. I've been all the way through it trying to find an error. Haven't found it yet. It is a good picture of what goes on in this county. And he brought the man to life. This was a man that had money. He wasn't a sharecropper, and he had enough money after the Civil War to buy Magnolia Mills from Bob McKenney's great-grandfather.
With cash. With cash. Yeah. I have deduced that he was a natural businessman. And he realized apparently very early that what was going to happen, and converted his Confederate currency to gold. Because having lost, in a sense, everything at Bubbling Springs, the house gone, his crops gone, everything, he had enough cash to buy this beautiful property on White Oak Creek where Francis Hinson grew up, and which included a grist mill, a sawmill, a blacksmith shop, and a country store, and operated it for the rest of his life. Now, I had a good idea there, and it left me. Francis, what was I going to say? Yes.
What was his life like?
Okay. He, as you know, the war ended in the spring of 1865. He apparently stayed in the forest for quite a while. His wife and children, the ones who survived, were over across the river in Henry County at a place called Sulphur Wells. Sulphur Wells is underwater now, but the fishermen report from time to time that sulfur bubbles come bubbling up from the bottom. It's down there still, we just can't get there. They eventually came back, but he wanted to be far away from Dover and from the authorities there and from Fort Donelson as he could. And they bought this place on White Oak Creek. And in 1871, he found himself in Houston County instead of Stewart County without moving an inch. Operated the businesses there. Now his son Albert was his right arm during the war and after. And Albert and his family, I'm sure, did most of the active operation of these businesses that he participated. So he died. He lived 9 years. He died in 1874. We don't know what day he was born. We know he was born in July of 1807, and so he could have died on his birthday in July of 1874, at 67 or thereabouts. Yes, sir.
The title says the one-man war, but I would imagine he must have had quite a support network of local people that knew he was there and were taking care of him, feeding him, and so forth.
They did indeed, although he could have done a pretty thorough job of that by himself, because he was self-reliant, he knew how to survive. But yes, certainly there were friends there, and that reminds me of an important point, because there were Union families in that area too. And yet, in spite of the fact that he had growing rewards for his dead body brought into Dover, nobody ever turned him in. The Union families, I think, respected him that much. And right towards the end of the war, it is my belief that he thinned out some of these hoodlums who'd been victimizing all those helpless families, because there were people who made a living on that because the men were gone to war. And people like that always victimize the helpless. They don't victimize people with guns. And the historical marker says he had 34 notches on his rifle. That's not true. He had 34 1/8-inch circles on the top surface of his octagonal barrel. But he also, up between the front sight and the muzzle, you can see this in one of the pictures that's in the book, he had some little notches. And it's my theory that those represent hoodlums that he sent to their reward. And I think that, it's just conjecture, but I can't think of any other reason that they would be there, and I can't, it would help to explain why the Union sympathizing families in the area never once turned him in. Another question? Yes, sir.
In all your research, where do you think Jack Hinson is buried at?
The question is, where do I think he's buried? He's buried in Cane Creek Cemetery. Albert, in the late 1890s, had an obelisk monument put up there for his family. If you go to Cane Creek Cemetery and go all the way back to the oldest part, that's where I believe he's buried. And you'll see the obelisk. And then he's buried there, his wife is buried there, several of their children are buried there. And how can I say, if you're looking at it beyond the end of the cemetery, away from the road end, just to the left of that is where I think Jack and Elizabeth are buried. Now, Jack's great-grandson, John Stewart, who was very helpful in all this, was also very zealous. He was also a Hinson, and he was inclined to do things without consulting anybody else. And he took it upon himself to have a gravestone put up there, and it identifies, it has the wrong birth year and the wrong death year. He didn't mention it to Francis or any of the family or me before he did it. It was just a fait accompli. And It also says Captain, Infantry, Confederate States Army. Well, he was never in the Confederate Army at all, and I wish Stewart hadn't done that. I really do. But I do think that in terms of the location, he's within a few feet, one way or the other, of where Jack Hinson is buried. Incidentally, there's a guy who shall remain nameless, who's running around all over the territory here, bad-mouthing me in the book, and claiming that Jack commanded, he was the dashing commander of a group of Confederate high-class guerrillas, partisans. And it's just not true. There's no evidence that he was ever even in the Confederate Army in any way. And so I have been forced to write a position paper stating the evidence for my position. And I hope you'll take one of those home. Kate has them on a table here somewhere, out in the lobby, I think. Yeah, I don't want to belabor that point, but Jack Hinson was a one-man show. He had no support. The only time he was ever not operating alone was when he operated with Nathan Bedford Forrest on at least 3 occasions as a guide. He made it possible for Forrest to move 30 miles with artillery up the west bank of the Tennessee River without being noticed. And when they opened fire on Johnsonville, that was their first clue. Yes.
I have a question about the rifle. It was custom made for long distance accuracy. Do you know who made it or where it was made?
Yeah, at the time the book was published, this always happens. I now know who made it, but I didn't when the book was published. We knew his initials. And I won't waste your time telling you how we found out, but it was just one of those things that was dropped in my lap by God. We now know there's a book published by the Tennessee Historical Commission on early gun makers in Tennessee. And we were able to take those initials and the dates and definitely identify the maker of the gun. And he was, what's the next county south of Humphreys?
Harry.
Lewis? Did somebody? Lewis County. He was in Lewis County. And I don't remember his name, but I now have it written down. I have the book. I have the book with his identification in it. So I wish I'd known that before the book was published. And it was custom made. And it's the heaviest rifle I've ever picked up. I can't hold it steady at offhand. It was made to be fired from a rest.
Colonel, thank you for your book on Southern history there. I've got a question. Other than the dead bodies laying around, how do you kind of figure out it was really him that was killing them?
Of course, they weren't there. They didn't know. But they knew that somebody was doing it. And incidentally, he wasn't the only one. And he slowly developed a reputation. And until there was just no question about the fact that the guy that was doing most of this was old Jack Hinson. And there was a reward for his death that grew. I don't know the numbers. I don't know how great the reward became, but nobody ever tried to claim it.
Tell about the 100-acre field.
Okay. Jane asked me to tell about the 100-acre field. That's another thing we found thanks to, my goodness, I'll think of his name. He's dead now. His wife Bonnie is still with us. Alvin Crutcher. He told us how to find the 100-acre field. He was old enough to have heard it called by that name and knew exactly where it was, and incidentally, it's still cleared. It belongs to West Vaco, or did last time I was out there. In the days of the story in the book, it was part of his property. And he was, by this time, he was a renegade. He was wanted. And he was heading back. He'd been to the area near Dover to see after his freed slaves. And incidentally, he freed them all in the summer of 1862 before the Emancipation Proclamation. We're what are we talking about here? The 100-acre field? Help me to remember to get back to that, because I want to point something out to you. Talking about what a keen, sharp-minded businessman he was, and also what a responsible man he was. You know, there were different kinds of slave owners, and most of them were benevolent. Most of them considered them part of the family. In fact, I quote a couple of things from a man's journal in Kentucky, nearby in Christian County, where he says things like, one of his slave girls is going to marry a fine young man that belongs to Colonel so-and-so. There is rejoicing in the family. That they didn't look upon them as things to be that worked to death. They looked upon them really as part of the family. Another time he says, Trad has the measles, and I fear that he may not live. We sent for the doctor and so forth. Jack Hinson was that kind of a slave owner. And in summer of 1862, this is my surmise, he looked ahead, and he had already seen slaves from people around him being confiscated by the occupation troops and never seen again. And what they did was take them and put them into forced labor. And you didn't know that they were being cared for, you didn't know how they were being treated, and so forth. And so it occurred to him that if he legally freed his slaves, they would be in a much safer position than those others who weren't freed. They wouldn't be so likely to be confiscated and taken away. And so he gave them all legal freedom and made them what we call freedmen in those days. In the summer of 1862, before the Emancipation Proclamation was announced, he was always ahead of the curve, this guy. Now back to the 100-acre field. He had been to check on his servants and was leaving early in the morning, and as he headed southeast, he rode out into the 100-acre field, and there was high broom sage in it. And he saw two soldiers across the field coming out of the woods the other way toward him before they saw him. And he simply leaned over on the offside of his horse, dropped the rifle into the broom sage, and then rode on to meet them. And they saw him and cantered over and stopped and said, do you know Jack Hinson? And he said, yes, which was the truth. They said, have you seen him lately? And he said, as a matter of fact, I have, and that was the truth. He said, where? And he said, over on Standing Rock Creek, which was the truth. And he told them exactly where he had been just a little while earlier and told them how to get there, but he told them how to get there a roundabout way. And as soon as they rode off, he headed for Standing Rock Creek a shorter way and was waiting for them when they got there and killed them both. Anybody else? Apparently, and I keep saying apparently because there's so little to go on, I have to take this piece, and that piece, and the only thing that makes sense is the fourth piece. And that's what I explain, I hope, in the introduction. That the reason that I chose these assumptions or conclusions that I made was because to choose anything else would be illogical, or would go against local custom or the custom of the time or common sense. Let's see, I've already forgotten where I was going next with this. Anybody have another question? Over there. I got okay.
Do you think that the landscaping down at the Signature Rock is similar to what it would have been at that area?
It's completely unchanged, except that the big cave down near the bottom of the bluff, in 1966, an earthquake caved it in. You can still see where it was, but that's the only change to my knowledge.
Is it below the flat
Yes,
slate
if
rock?
you're sitting on that ledge, his firing point, his sleeping cave was over to the right and down the hill just a little. It's a climb to get there. Everything's a climb. The big cave was way down at the bottom, but they were both over to the right. If you're looking at the river, they were both over to the right. Now, there was somebody over here. Yes, sir.
Listen, I've heard that he shot an officer. that true?
That he was,
Just shot officers of the Union Army?
those were his targets of choice. Yeah. His preference was officers because it was officers who he held responsible for the murder and mutilation of his sons. He looked for epaulets. Yeah. He wasn't, he wasn't exclusive or snobbish about it. He would shoot enlisted men too. In fact, he took great pleasure in one, the sergeant that put the heads on the gate post. Someone else? Yes, ma'am.
Bubbling Springs, the location, the best estimate of the location?
Yes, she asked about Bubbling Springs and where is it and how did we know. When I started, the family didn't know. They didn't know which two boys had been murdered. They didn't know where the plantation was, but they knew it was called Bubbling Springs. And they knew the general direction. And it turns out to be the old Keel place. I searched and searched until I found the terrain that matched what we did know. And, not Keel, Keeling. Keel. And what's now called Keel Hollow Road in Dover was then Jack Hinson's driveway, his lane. And you follow it back to where the road makes a sharp turn to the right and goes across a little bridge, and there's a house right in front of you. It's the old Keel house. And it's my belief that that house is built on the foundation of the house, his house that was burned by the Union soldiers. And thanks to two friends of Pam Ford's who work in the courthouse, they were able to get me a chain of possession on that property. Once I decided this had to be it, they proved it for me. And we now have a chain of possession all the way from Keel back to Jack Hinson. And Bubbling Springs is an appropriate name. These are beautiful springs that just come bubbling up out of the ground, and they become the headwaters of what is called to this day Hinson Creek. And it runs parallel to his lane, to what is now Keel Hollow Road, out to the north towards Highway 79. It's a beautiful stream. Any other questions? Yes.
I really enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
I made a list of questions to ask, but by the time I had finished reading it, they were all answered.
That's really, that's a wonderful compliment. She said she made a list of questions she was going to ask me, but by the time she finished the book, they were all answered. Thank you, that's encouraging.
One question about the Wigginses that killed Albert.
Yes.
Do you know of what the confrontation was, or have you learned?
We never knew, and probably never will. She's asking about Albert Hinson, Jack's son, who was his mainstay during the war, because when Jack was in the forest, he needed someone to look after his wife and the rest of the family, and that's what Albert did. And later, when he had a grown son, two boys in Danville named Wiggins ambushed him one night as he was coming home and shot him. And he lingered and suffered, how long, Francis? At least a month before he finally died. And his son buried Albert, he set out to get the guys that shot him, and he knew which one had actually done the shooting. He cut that guy's heart completely out of his chest. Hinsons are that way. And I think it's poetic because Ab was coming home from the White Oak Creek into Danville, and where he crossed the railroad track was where by the station there. That was really the heart of Danville. And that's exactly where he was, a straddle of the railroad tracks when this boy shot him. And when, what was the son's name who killed him, Francis?
Joseph.
No, it wasn't Charles.
Joseph.
Joseph. Thank you. Thank you. When young Joseph went and got the Wiggins boy that had killed his dad, he cut his heart out and hung it on the railroad crossing sign right where Ab had been when he was shot. So he hung his heart in the heart of Danville. I've always thought that was kind of appropriate. And what's also interesting is that Wiggins boy was never charged with Ab's death, and the Hinson boy was never charged with killing him and cutting his heart off. He did move up the river, downstream, and across the river into Kentucky and married, but he died not long after that with tuberculosis, and I think he never had any children. But one of the things that I think the book presents is the price of vengeance. It cost Jack Hinson at least six of his children, his life as he had known it, his beautiful plantation home and all that. And he lived out the rest of his life every day under threat of being marched before a military tribunal and hanged. In fact, right at the end of his life, that was going on, and we found this newspaper story that said, the Peace Boys. I've never been able to find out who that was, Jimmy. If you ever do, please let me know. It said the Peace Boys got a writ of habeas corpus and protected him from that just before he died. In other words, even up to the time he died, this sword of Damocles was hanging over his head every day. But he didn't pay much attention to it. You can tell that by the records. He went on doing his business, playing with his grandchildren, and doing his rifle marksmanship competition with his friend, whose name I can't think of at the moment.
Bateman.
From Humboldt County. What was it?
Bateman.
Ah, Patrick Henry Bateman. I take her with me everywhere I go.
Go.
Yeah, it seems to me, and again, you can only surmise because the records are gone. The family Bible, the letters, the photographs, everything that I wish I had burned up in that house, and when they drove them away. And but you can only take the pieces and then step back and look at them, and you get the big picture. He was obviously not the least bit disturbed or concerned or worried about the fact that any day he could be taken to Dover and hanged. He just went on with his business, went on with his farm, went on playing with his grandchildren and enjoying his friends in the twilight of their years, and died that way. Now, I heard just recently somebody had found a piece that said that the day he died, he had been seized with abdominal pain. It's another one of those things you wish you had before the book was published. And so I don't know what to make of that, and I won't try. But he lived to be what in those days was a very old man. In fact, he was an old man when he took to the woods, which is one thing that makes the whole story so remarkable. It's tough enough if you're 19 years old sleeping in a cave and sleeping on the wet ground in the winter as well as in the spring, summer, and fall. But when you're in effect, physiologically, an old man, way past middle age, when you begin all that, it makes it even more remarkable. And I must say, for those of you who can think in these terms, by the end of the war, the Union had committed elements of 9 regiments, both infantry and cavalry, mounted and on foot, and an amphibious task force of Marines with specially designed shallow draft, high-speed boats after that one old man, and they never got him. Also, you'll be interested to know, there's one really the most difficult thing in the whole story to untangle was based on one dispatch in the official record. And it had to do with his son Robert, who was by this time operating under the alias of his dead brother, who was one of the 2 that had been murdered and started all this. Robert Hinson, I got so interested in him, I'd like to write a book about Robert Hinson, because I only discovered him because I was looking into his father's story. But Robert Hinson must have been like Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was a natural born military leader. and audacious. He was captured 3 times and escaped all 3 times. The Union was looking for him under about 3 different names, but what he did was what this other researcher thinks Jack Hinson did. He really was the dashing commander of a mounted group of Confederate partisans. And they were known to the Union as Hinson's command. Not Hinson's criminals or Hinson's thugs, but they respected them enough to refer to them in their dispatches as Hinson's command. And they operated here. They operated everywhere, from Smithland to Waverly and freely. I mean, the Union never knew where and when to expect them. But their favorite place, I call it in the book, is Sherwood Forest. Their base of operations was here in this area, especially along Wells Creek. And they owned the place. And the people strongly supported them. I hope if you read the book, you'll find the story of Robert Hinson extremely interesting. And if he hadn't been killed in an unexpected encounter with the Union unit, I think he could have wound up in the same category as one in Virginia. I'm kind of tired, and names don't come readily to me.
Mosby.
John Singleton Mosby, John Hunt Morgan of Kentucky. I think he would have been looked upon in the same category, same class with those guys, but he didn't live that long. He's the second most amazing person in the book after his dad. Any other questions? Well, I thank you for your patience. Yes, ma'am.
Did you tell them about the towhead and the surrender of the gunboat?
Yeah. She asked about the towhead chute and the surrender of the gunboat. That's really the almost the theme of the story. Once he takes to the woods, he could kill them from any place, and he did. From duck blinds along the Cumberland to from duck blinds on the other side in Hendry County and in Benton. Is that Benton County? Yeah. And he did as far north as Fort Hyman. But his favorite place was on Graffin Reed's Bluff, which was not known by that name at the time, and it isn't known by that name today. Today it's called Name Rock Hill. And what made it so perfect was that it overlooks the Tennessee River, and at that point the channel turns in and runs between the bank and a little island called the Towhead. And because of that, the force of the river was concentrated in that raceway. It was like a mill race, and so the current was so fast that to go downstream towards Paducah was a hard stopper because you went so fast. To go upstream towards Danville, you could hardly make any progress at all. And I got a lot of my technical information about that from Frank Cherry here, and I'll always be grateful to him. But the problem that the Union had was they were trying to move supplies from Paducah and Cairo southward to Johnsonville, where they offloaded them and took them on trains over to Sherman and the others. But they had to go through the Towhead chute to get there. And they had to go so slowly that they were almost stationary targets. And that's what made that position his favorite, and what made it so perfect from his point of view. And she asked about the gunboat that surrendered. On one occasion, an armed gunboat, not a transport, not a mail packet, but a gunboat that also had embarked Union troops with weapons. He killed so many as they tried to make it up the Towhead chute that the captain of the ship dropped anchor fore and aft, ran up the white flag, and surrendered to that one old man. It's the only time in military history that an armed gunboat with embarked armed troops has ever surrendered to one man. Of course, the captain didn't realize that he was surrendering to just one man, but the rifle fire was so deadly, he assumed that there was a whole battalion up there shooting at him. And after he ran up the surrender flag, nothing happened. And here's poor old Jack sitting up there on his ledge wondering what to do next. He's armed with a single shot, muzzle loaded rifle and a pistol, and the pistol's in the cave. And so he didn't, it was an awkward standoff for both of them. And finally the captain, when he saw that John Hunt Morgan was not going to come sweeping down the riverbank with his cavalry and take possession of all those prisoners, he finally wised up and weighed anchor and brought down the white flag and ran up his own and steamed away. And Jack couldn't keep firing on him because the white flag was up. So it was really an incredible moment. He made military history twice. That one he did alone. The other one was with Forrest at Johnsonville, because it's the only time in history that a ground commander, in this case Forrest, captured enemy ships and then turned around and used them against that same enemy in the same battle. Now, Jack didn't do that by himself, but he helped to make it possible. Anybody else? You getting tired of this? Well, I'll be merciful. Have we missed anything? Good. Well, as I said, Joe and the judge will be glad to inscribe your books for you, as will I, and we'll be back here at a table in the back of the room. But meanwhile, Kay, don't you have refreshments?
Don't you
You
have
have food for these
refreshments?
people?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
We'll let you and the judge and Mr. Joe McCormick go over to your places. And if Mrs. Hinson wants to join you over there for photographs,
Would you do that, Francis?
I met him